Raiden Shogun and Ayato are getting the rerun banners as we speak, and since they are two very popular characters, I really wanted to address their place in the Dendro meta, how good they are right now, and if I believe you should pull for them. In this video, I'll also cover their overall strengths and weaknesses, both inside and outside of Dendro teams, while obviously mostly focusing on the new Dendro reaction to help give you guys a better idea of how strong they are right now, and if they are worth it. Now, as always, before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's get right into the video. Alright, first and foremost, let's actually start with Ayato, before moving on to Raiden Shogun, as while we will be covering both of them, Ayato is a bit more straightforward in where he excels and how good he is with Dendro and just overall. The reason for this is because Ayato is generally speaking going to be the premier on-field Hydro option for many different reactions. In fact, in any team that wants to Hyperbloom or Electro-Charged or even some other Hydro reactions that I'll cover, having an Ayato on-field, constantly applying Hydro and dealing good damage is going to be incredibly valuable for your team. The reason for this is because Ayato's main role is to be used as an on-field Hydro applier, since the elemental skill will make all of his attacks deal Hydro damage, and they also have pretty good scalings. Because of that, you can apply a ton of Hydro, deal good damage, and enable very powerful reactions like Bloom and Hyperbloom, as well as non-Dendro ones like Electro-Charged. In fact, before we even talk more about Ayato himself, you have to understand how powerful some of these reactions are, like especially Hyperbloom. Hyperbloom teams where you pair Dendro, Hydro, and Electro together are some of the strongest teams in the game right now, especially for single target. The reason for this is because all you need is a Dendro support, like the main character or Nahida, an Electro support to proc all the Cs that you'll be generating, like Kuki or even Raiden Shogun, who we'll talk about, and then someone who can apply a good amount of Hydro, like for example Ayato. Now, while there are many different Hydro options you can run, most of them are going to be off-field Hydros, to where when you need a character to be on-field and to deal good damage on top of your Hyperbloom damage, Ayato is generally going to be the best option. While Child is better in, for example, Vaporize teams with Xiangling, in Hyperbloom teams he's usually not as good because it's harder to have a consistent rotation, and overall Ayato will be better over long periods of time, as well as being very easy and straightforward. The only other real on-field Hydro is going to be Kokomi, which you can use if you need a healer, and while she is a good character, obviously her damage will be a lot worse. So because of that, Ayato is just really good at applying Hydro from on-field, and since the meta right now is teams like Hyperbloom, Ayato is a great option for those teams. On top of just Hyperbloom, in AoE you can do Burgeon, which is where you replace the Electro character in that team with a Pyro one, like Toma or Xiangling, which is an incredibly powerful reaction against a lot of enemies because of the way Burgeon and Bloom works, where when you're fighting multiple enemies, you're generating more blooms, more seeds since you're hitting multiple enemies at the same time, and then each of your Dendro cores are exploding with the Burgeon reaction, dealing AoE damage to everything around them, excelling against large groups of enemies. And so because of that, since the Hydro Dendro reactions are really good, obviously a character like Ayato is going to be really good. If that wasn't enough, he also has a burst that lasts for an incredibly long time, like genuinely this 18-second duration with a 20-second cooldown makes for a very efficient burst that you can use to apply a decent amount of off-field Hydro while also buffing your normal attack. If that wasn't enough, in pure Bloom teams with Nilou and Nahida, Ayato can even be used as the last flex slot as an off-field Hydro, as while there are other options like Yelan or Xingqiu for single target, if you want AoE consistent Hydro application, someone like Ayato in an off-field build can actually work surprisingly well. With that said though, Ayato's role is very straightforward. You put him on field, deal good Hydro damage, and apply good Hydro, and just that in and of itself is very valuable given how good the Hydro element is, both in Dendro teams like Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon, but also outside of Dendro, especially in Electro-Charged or Taser teams, where you pair him with Electro characters like Beidou and Fischl, and then a support like Kazuo or Bennett to make for very powerful teams both with and without Dendro. Because of that, I believe Ayato is an incredibly versatile and very good character who I would recommend pulling for if you need a Hydro character in those slots. Now do keep in mind though, the thing with Hydro 5 stars that I've always believed is that they are pretty replaceable and interchangeable amongst each other. While Child is better in Xiangling teams, you can replace him with Ayato if you don't have him, and the same can be said in teams where Ayato is the best. In fact, if you have Kokomi but not Ayato, you can use Kokomi in teams where you'd use Ayato and then go for an offensive Electro option instead of a healer that you would otherwise need. The same can be said with using Child instead of Ayato, as while you may get a bit less value in certain teams, it can work. And so generally speaking, for many accounts, I would recommend pulling for one Hydro 5-star, but once you already have one in a team that you want to use, you may not need to collect them all, as you can generally use them interchangeably, despite all of them having their specific focus or specific niche, like Child with Xiangling, Yelan and double Hydro Xingqiu teams, and Ayato in Hyperbloom and Electro-Charged. With that said though, other advantages of Ayato are that he's not constellation dependent at all, and also he is pretty easy to build. While I'm using Echoes because I farmed this set for Shao, you can pretty much slap whatever you have on him, with a especially good set being the 4-piece Gladiator, but more on his builds in my next video, which will be an updated Ayato guide. Next up though, we have to talk about Raiden Shogun, who's going to be a bit more of a complicated character than Ayato in terms of her synergy with Dendro. In fact, I want to start things off by by saying that overall, Raiden is a very powerful character who is typically used as a on-field either hypercarry or just damage dealer who applies electro, gives energy to your entire team, while enabling your off-field burst damage dealers like Xiangling and Xingqiu to deal good damage. Because of that, there's traditionally been like two main ways to play her, where you're either using her as a pure hypercarry, which is especially relevant after your second constellation, or in a variation of the national team, where you're using Raiden with Bennett, Xiangling, and Xingqiu for just a ton of really good on-field damage, especially single target, but also just in general, where you're spamming a bunch of different reactions, notably Vaporize and Overload. Raiden's biggest strength has pretty much always been her incredibly high burst damage, while also regenerating energy to your entire team, giving your team comps easier rotations and more room for error than something like a Child Xiangling team, which can be more strict. With that said, how good is she in the new Dendro meta? Well, there are two main reactions that she can be used in, Hyperbloom and Aggravate. Starting things off, let's talk about the better of the two, at least for Raiden, which is going to be her Hyperbloom teams. Now, this may sound weird because Hyperbloom, as you know, is a transformative reaction that only scales on your level and your elemental mastery. This means that the scalings of your electro abilities, your crit damage, and all of that are not factored into your Hyperbloom damage, which means that you're going to be stacking full elemental mastery on your Raiden if you want to use her in a Hyperbloom team. Now, while that may sound crazy at first and it may sound like a meme, it is actually really powerful and can be the best offensive option for Hyperbloom solely because of the way her elemental skill works. In fact, in a Hyperbloom Raiden team, you are only using her skill, like her burst is only used for like iframes if you want to dodge something or really need energy, but typically you're just using her for her skill, as it's an ability that applies electro from off field at a pretty fast rate while also having a very long duration of 25 seconds with a 10-second cooldown, meaning its uptime is incredible. This means that you can swap into your Raiden as rarely as possible compared to other electro characters, while also getting the full value of constant off-field electro application, hitting all of the cores on the ground, allowing you to Hyperbloom very consistently. Because of that, and also the extra burst damage that you're gaining from your elemental skill, Raiden's offensive Hyperbloom capabilities are generally going to be the best damage overall. You stack elemental mastery on her polearm, artifact set, and artifact stats, and she can just get a ton of value by just pressing your skill and then forgetting about her, as once every 0.9 seconds, the eye generated from your elemental skill can shoot out a hit of electro damage. This electro damage is AoE, meaning it's very good at hitting the seeds, the cores on the ground, allowing you to Hyperbloom reliably. Now, the main downsides here, and the main reason why I sometimes don't recommend this, is because yes, it is the best offensive option, so it's just good and doesn't require the most investment. I want to make that clear, it is a good option. The main downside is that there are alternatives like Kuki, who, especially with their second constellation, which can give her 100% uptime, can allow you to have both a reliable Hyperbloomer and a healer as a 2-in-1 slot, which can be better for your team if you also need a healer. If you don't and you just want an offensive option, Raiden can be the best, especially because of how long her skill lasts for, meaning that you don't have to swap into her very often, whereas Kuki's skill only has a 15-second duration with your second constellation, 12 without it, which makes it to where you have to swap into her every 15 seconds, which is a bit weird given how a lot of rotations in the game are around 20 seconds or so having a longer duration is obviously better. Kuki, especially with her second constellation, can be an exceptional 2-in-1 for Hyperbloom, to where you don't need to use EM Raiden, but EM Raiden will still be the best offensive option for Hyperbloom specifically, just because of the way her elemental skill works and how consistent it is at proccing cores, which is something that you wouldn't be able to say about a character like Fischl, who is incredibly powerful as an electro support, but since her off-field damage is mostly single target, it won't proc cores as consistently as someone like Raiden. Oh, and also, before moving on, in case you're wondering about someone like Dori is just a worse version of Kuki, because yes, her burst applies electro faster, or rather deals electro damage at a faster rate. The energy cost is very high, and her energy generation is terrible, and also the uptime is 12 out of 20, so she's just not a good character overall, especially compared to Kuki or Raiden. Something else I wanted to say about Raiden Shogun, though, is that honestly, since she's such a good either burst carry or on-field driver for a Xiangling team, if you also have a Kuki, you can use your Kuki for Hyperbloom and then your Raiden in another team, because she's such a valuable unit. That means you can have two very powerful teams without using your Raiden for Hyperbloom, whereas if you already have a powerful second team, then you can be very happy to use your Raiden in a Hyperbloom team, and you can get a lot of value. These teams might not need healers, especially if you run damage reducing supports like Beidou and Xingqiu, but if you do need a healer, then keep in mind that you might want to use someone like Kuki, whereas as I mentioned many times already, Raiden's offensive capabilities here are honestly surprisingly good, but not something that I would recommend pulling for as an upgrade if you already have a C2 Kuki, and that is the distinction that I really wanted to make you guys more capable of deciding if she's worth your Primo Gems, depending on what playstyle you choose to use. Lastly, regarding Aggravate Raiden, it is pretty decent and just okay overall. The damage increase she gains from Aggravate compared to her other teams isn't as high as another character like Keqing, for example. Because of that, being able to use her with Dendro supports like Nahida gives her more flexibility in teams, and those teams are certainly viable, but they're not inherently better than her other ones. And overall, I think Aggravate Raiden is pretty decent, but not the most meta, especially at C0 at least. I know at C2, since you have like the Def Shred and stuff, it does get better and can be more viable similarly to a Hypercarry team. In general, it's just another team option for your Raiden. Overall though, I think Raiden's a very good character, even more flexible now, being able to be ran with Dendro, especially in Hyperbloom, or without it as a Hypercarry or in a Shangling national team, making her a really good unit overall and a very forgiving one, especially with how she gives your team energy. At the cost, however, of requiring a lot of field time to give you energy. Obviously, you have to build your team around her, but once you do that, she is very good as a character and one who I recommend. On top of just that, her builds are relatively flexible. Like while her set bonus for a standard Hypercarry build needs to be Emblem, this domain is very efficient to farm, and then her main stats on Sands and Goblet can honestly be variable based on your substats and teams, so there is some flexibility, as well as having a very good free-to-play weapon that everyone has access to with the Catch for a Hypercarry build, or the Katane Crossbeer for a Elemental Mastery Hyperbloom team, with Dragon's Bane also being great for Hyperbloom if you got it from the gacha. Obviously, for a Hyperbloom team, you would want Gilded Dreams or the new Flower set, and while the newer set can be better, it isn't as efficient to farm as Gilded, which again, you're probably going to need for any account anyways, as it comes with the Deepwood set as well, which is essential for basically any Dendro team, given the fact that it decreases Dendro resistance of opponents, making Deepwood and Gilded a very efficient domain as well. So Raiden's a character who you can passively gear while gearing your other characters for whichever teams you plan on playing. Because of that, I believe both Raiden and Ayato are very good characters. Their value does depend on who you have, what teams you want to play, and also like what weapons and artifacts you already have farmed. But in general, I believe both of them are great in their respective roles, and you could be happy pulling for either of them or both of them if you want to play them with Dendro, which is the point of this video, but also just as standalone units, they are very good. And so overall, that is about it. I really hope you enjoyed this shorter video, but more focused on just Raiden, Ayato, how good they are, especially in the new meta, and just overall. If there's anything I want to add, as always, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. I really hope this video was helpful, and I hope you guys win your 50/50s on whichever character you choose to pull for. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.